Hello everyone, welcome to my channel Love, Lies and Betrayal. Let's move to the video.
I grew up in a small, quiet town in Maine, where life moved as slowly as the seasons themselves. Our house sat on the edge of a dense hill, its once bright white exterior softened by the weather, and years inside, it remained the same aged wooden floors that never went out of style books stacked in corners and warmth that didn't come from a central heating system, but from the people who lived there. My father was a deep and thoughtful man. He spent most of his time in his study flipping through books or scribbling notes onto yellowed pages. My mother, his complete opposite in every way, filled the house with energy. Her voice was bright and cheerful like the daisies she planted. Every spring in our garden it was a beautiful childhood, safe and predictable, wrapped in the kind of love that surrounded you quietly but completely. I never thought much about the future back then. Why would I when the present was so steady, so certain? But life isn't stable forever. When I was 16, my father died suddenly, a sharp, unbearable pain. They said he had been perfectly healthy, or at least we thought so. One moment he was there in his study, mumbling about misplaced notes. The next, he was gone, just like that. The loss hit us like a storm. My mother, who had always been my anchor, crumbled under its weight. Her laughter disappeared, her energy faded, and soon it felt like I was the one holding together what was left of our home. The house became quiet in a way that was impossible to ignore, where there had once been shared dinners and conversations about everything and nothing. There was now only silence. My mother spent her days lost in thought, staring out the window as if she could see something far, far away. I tried to fill the emptiness to bring back the light we had lost. But that wasn't the kind of thing that could be fixed with a joke or a hug. So I learned to live in the silence to grow up faster than I should have. By the time I was 19, I was used to the quiet. I was preparing for my second year of college when my mother sat me down in the living room and told me she was getting remarried. The news took me by surprise. I had always known she was lonely, that she missed having someone to share her days with, but I never expected her to go this far. Or maybe I just didn't expect it to happen so soon. Soon, I didn't know how to feel. A part of me was happy for her. Another part of me wasn't sure how to process the idea of someone else stepping into the space my father had left behind when I met David. I began to understand he wasn't trying to replace my father. He was entirely different, warm and kind, with a quiet steadiness that seemed to match my mother's energy perfectly. He made her smile in a way I hadn't seen in years. He didn't impose or push too hard. He simply fit into our lives like a puzzle piece we hadn't realized was missing for the first time in a long while. I felt hopeful for her. David had a son, Ryan, who was 18, just a year younger than me. He was tall and lean, with an unreadable expression that made it hard to tell what he was thinking when we met. It was awkward, as these things usually are. We shook hands, exchanged polite smiles, and tried to figure out our places in this strange new family. The dynamic was odd. It was strange to think of him as a brother. It was strange to think of David as a father. But I told myself we would figure it out. In the first few weeks, everything felt hesitant, as if we were all tiptoeing around each other. My mother was happier, and David brought an easy rhythm to the house, but Ryan and I were like strangers sharing a space too small to ignore each other. He spent most of his time alone, either walking in the woods behind the house or reading in his room. I did my best to stay out of his way, unsure whether he wanted to connect or prefer the distance. Still, there were quiet, fleeting moments I couldn't quite explain, like when we passed each other in the kitchen and somehow our hands brushed as he reached for a cup. It was the smallest thing, but I pulled my hand back as if I had been burned, where the time I caught him looking at me during dinner. His expression unreadable. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away. I told myself it was nothing. Of course he was looking, there was nothing else to focus on. And the tension I felt was just the awkwardness of two people adjusting to a new life. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more it seemed to linger, a quiet, persistent undercurrent in our
Interactions one evening, as summer began to fade, I found myself on the porch watching fireflies flip lazily in the yard. Ryan stepped outside, his presence startling me. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice soft in the quiet. I shook my head. "Just needed some air." He nodded and leaned against the railing. We fell into a comfortable silence for a while. neither of us speaking. The night stretched around us thick with the sound of crickets and rustling leaves. "Do you like it here?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. "It's different," he admitted, "but not bad." I wasn't sure why his answer made me smile, but that was the first time I felt like we were seeing each other, not as awkward pieces of this new makeshift family, but as people that was when it started, not with a spark or a confession, but with the simplest of connections. Looking back, I wonder if things could have been different if I had walked away that night, if I had ignored the quiet pull I felt toward him, but I didn't, and neither did he, and the unspoken tension between us only grew. The house was quieter than usual that afternoon. My mother and David had gone into town for groceries, leaving Ryan and me alone. It wasn't unusual. David trusted us to manage on our own, but the silence felt heavier when it was just the two of us. I tried to ignore it by keeping busy with housework, but I couldn't escape awareness of his presence somewhere in the house. After finishing the laundry, I decided to take a shower. The hot water was soothing, washing away a tension. I hadn't even realized I was carrying, wrapping a towel around myself. I stepped into the hallway, still drying my hair, and nearly ran into Ryan. "Oh, sorry," I stammered. Stepping back, my heart leapt to my throat. His eyes widened in surprise at first, then softened into something else, something unspoken. The air between us shifted thick with a tension I couldn't name. My breath caught for a moment. Neither of us moved. "It's okay," he finally said, his voice quieter than usual. His gaze lingered not inappropriately, but searching as if he was trying to understand something. I should have walked away, I knew that, but my feet stayed planted, my pulse pounding in my ears. He didn't move either. The silence stretched between us, fragile, electric, and then before I could think, he reached out his fingers, brushing lightly against my wrist. "Come with me," he said softly. I didn't answer. I couldn't. But I followed him. He led me to his room, and the door closed gently behind us. The space was dimly lit. The curtains were drawn, shielding against the afternoon sunlight. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent. What was I doing? What was he doing? This wasn't normal, this wasn't right, and yet the pull between us was undeniable. "Laria." He said my name, like it was something fragile, something he wasn't sure he had the right to say. "No," I whispered. He stopped, the words caught in his throat. His expression was raw, conflicted, as if he were battling himself. I could feel my heart pounding, my breath shallow. "Ryan," before I could say another word. He stepped closer. His fingers brushed a stray lock of hair from my face, a touch so light, so hesitant, yet it sent a shiver down my spine. I knew we were crossing a line we could never uncross, but in that moment, it didn't seem to matter what. What happened next wasn't planned or thought out. It was a tangle of emotions, confusion, fear, longing, all crashing together, and reckless abandon. We didn't speak. Saying it aloud would make it real, and maybe we weren't ready for that. Instead, we let silence fill the space between us. A raw, unspoken connection neither of us could deny. When the weight of what we had done settled like a storm cloud in the room, I sat on the edge of his bed, clutching the sheet around me like armor. Ryan stood near the window, his back to me, shoulders tense. The words stuck in my throat, but I couldn't force them out. "I should go," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to look at me, and for a fleeting moment I thought he might ask me to stay, but he didn't. He only nodded, his expression unreadable. I left without another word. The door clicked shut behind me, and as I stepped into the hallway, reality crashed over me like a wave. I hurried back to my room, locking the door behind me, as if that alone could keep the truth out. I sat on my bed, head in my hands, replaying every moment. What had we done? What had I done? Guilt and confusion twisted in my chest, but beneath it all there was something else, something I couldn't name. Something I was too afraid to face. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that would never happen again, but deep down, I knew the truth. We had crossed a line, and nothing would ever be the same again. The days after that afternoon in Ryan's room passed in a haze, every moment weighed down by guilt, shame, and something else, something I didn't dare name. I moved through the hours on autopilot, avoiding him at all costs. Meals became a strategic effort, arriving late or leaving early. If I heard him in the kitchen, I stayed in my room. If I caught a glimpse of him in the hallway, I turned and went the other way. My mother and David didn't seem to notice anything unusual, but inside me, a storm raged at night, when the house was silent. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything, the way his hand had brushed mine, the way he had looked at me, the way I had let it happen. I told myself it was a mistake, per APS in judgment, born from months of unresolved tension, but no matter how many times I tried to convince myself, the truth was inescapable. It didn't feel like a mistake, and that terrified me. The tension between us didn't fade even as I avoided him. If anything, it grew stronger. I could feel it in the air whenever we were in the same room, even when we didn't speak. It was like an invisible thread pulling us together. No matter how hard I tried to resist, Ryan wasn't good at hiding it either. He avoided direct conversation, but I caught him watching me from the corner of his eye. His expression was a mix of confusion and something else. Something I couldn't allow myself to think about. One day, I saw him sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. For a fleeting second, I almost went to him, but then he looked up, our eyes met, and the moment shattered. I turned and left before either of us could say a word. I thought keeping my distance would help. That if we didn't talk about it, maybe it would lose its power over us. Maybe we could pretend it never happened. But the more I tried to bury it, the heavier it became, pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. It all came to a head one evening. The house was quiet. My mother and David had gone to visit friends. It was just the two of us. I sat in the study, staring at the same paragraph in a book over and over again, too distracted to focus. The sun dipped below the horizon and the room dimmed, but I didn't bother turning on the light. I just sat there, lost in my tangled thoughts. A soft knock at the door made me freeze. My heart pounded. Loria Ryan's voice was quiet but firm. I didn't answer. I couldn't. There was a long silence, then a sigh. "I'll be in the backyard." I stayed where I was, for what felt like forever, debating whether to go to him. Every rational part of me screamed to stay, to let him wait, to let this whole thing fade. But my heart pulled me in another direction, and in the end, my heart won. The air was cool and crisp. Stars scattered across the sky like tiny distant beacons. Ryan sat on the bench near the garden, shoulders, hunched, hands clapped, passed between his knees. He looked up when he heard me, his expression unreadable. "Hey," I murmured, my voice barely audible in the stillness. "Hey." He gestured for me to sit. I hesitated, then lowered myself onto the bench, careful to keep a safe distance between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't exactly awkward, but it was heavy with everything we hadn't said. Finally, Ryan broke it. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice small. I swallowed hard, staring down at my hands. "Me neither." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "I've been trying to make sense of what happened, what it means, but I don't know." I nodded, still unable to meet his eyes. More silence, then slowly the words started to come. He talked about the guilt that had been eating away at him, the confusion, the fear of what this could mean for us. I told him about my own guilt, my own fears, my own pain, that I couldn't seem to escape. This wasn't supposed to happen. I said at one point, my voice trembling. "I know," he replied, "but it did." I had no response to that, but he didn't need one. The conversation stretched on, moving in starts and stops. The words were raw and unfiltered for the first time. We didn't hold anything back, and when the words finally ran out, silence settled over us once more. The night air was cool against my skin, but I barely felt it. My focus was entirely on him. Ryan shifted slightly, turning toward me. "Leah," I looked at him, really looked at him. His eyes were searching, filled with a vulnerability that made my chest ache. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered for just a moment too long. My breath caught, and for a fleeting second I thought about pulling away, but I didn't. He leaned in, his movement slow, cautious, giving me every chance to stop him. I didn't when his lips touched mine. It was soft, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure. Sure if he had the right, it wasn't driven by passion, but by something deeper, something unspoken. The kiss lingered, gentle, aching, filled with a quiet understanding of the bond we shared. When he pulled away, his hands remained lightly on my face. He searched my eyes for any sign of regret. There was none. Not yet. That moment was enough, but I knew forever wouldn't be. Since that night beneath the stars, everything had changed. There was no going back, not to the careful distance we had kept before, not to the tense silence and stolen glances what we had shared. The kiss, filled with emotions we had buried for so long, had opened something between us, something neither of us could ignore. Our bond deepened in ways I hadn't thought possible. At first it was cautious, restrained, a brush of his fingers against mine, when no one was looking, a glance that lingered a moment too long when we passed each other in the hallway. Small things. No one else would notice, but to us they felt enormous. But as the weeks passed, restraint gave way to something riskier. It started with late-night conversations, when the house was quiet and the rest of the world felt far away. I'd find him waiting for me on the porch or in the backyard. We talked for hours about everything, his hopes, my fears, the strange, precarious place we found ourselves in. There was something intoxicating about those nights, how they felt like stolen time, as if we had stepped outside the rules of the world just to be together. Then came the stolen moments, fleeting, electric, a brief touch as I passed him in the kitchen, his hand grazing the small of my back as he reached for a glass. A whispered word when we crossed paths in the hallway, the kind that stayed with me long after he had walked away. I had never felt this way before, the way even the smallest gestures could send my heart racing, the way I found myself yearning for the next moment, the next touch. But along with the longing came the guilt every time I looked at my mother or David. The weight of what we were doing pressed down on me like a stone. They were happy, they had built a life together, trusted us to find our place in this new family, and here we were betraying that trust in the worst way possible. I don't know how much longer we can do this, I whispered to Ryan one night. We were in his room. The door closed, the faint sounds of the television drifting up from the living room. He looked at me, conflict etched across his face. I know, he said quietly, but I don't know how to stop, neither did I. The more time we spent together, the harder it became to stay apart. It wasn't just the thrill of secrecy or the pull of forbidden desire, it was the way he understood me, the way he saw through the walls I had spent most of my life building with him. I didn't have to pretend. But secrecy came with its own risks. One afternoon, while helping my mother sort through old family photos in the living room, she glanced at me, her brow furrowing slightly. "You and Ryan have been spending a lot of time together lately," she said casually. Her voice was light, but there was something probing beneath the words. My hands froze over the stack of pictures, my heart skipping a beat. "We just getting to know each other," I said quickly, forcing a smile. She studied me for a moment before nodding. "That's good," she said, returning to her task. "I was worried it might be awkward for you, but it's nice to see you getting along." The tension in my chest eased, but only slightly, with each passing day. The risk of discovery grew. My mother and David suspected nothing yet, but the thought of what would happen if they ever found out kept me awake at night. Ryan felt it too. "Do you ever think about what would happen if they knew?" he asked me one evening. We were sitting on his floor, the door locked. The weight of his question filled the space between us all the time. I admitted it would destroy everything. He nodded, his gaze distant. "So what do we do?" I had no answer. Neither of us did. So we continued, trapped in the fragile balance of something that shouldn't exist, but had become impossible to let go of. The secrecy felt like walking a razor's edge, both exhilarating and terrifying. Every moment together was stolen, borrowed from a future we couldn't imagine, but couldn't stop chasing. There were times when the guilt became too much, when I lay awake wondering how we had gotten here and how we could ever find a way out. But then there were the moments when he looked at me or his hand brushed against mine, and the guilt disappeared, replaced by something far more powerful. We didn't know where we were headed or how this would end. We only knew that for now we couldn't stop, and so we didn't. For next part, subscribe for more. Don't forget to click the notification bell icon to stay notified.